session we had discussed about different types of services in the AngularJS. So we have seen that we have completely 5 types of services in our AngularJS. Those are provider, constant, and the simplified versions of provider or factory, service, and factory can be again simplified into value. So in this session we will discuss what are the difference between these services and when to use these services. So in our last session we had taken a simple example of a controller which has a book service which gets books from some dummy DB. So we had done this same service using provider, also using factory, also using service, and also by using value. So now we will see what are the difference between all these services and when to use these services. So when we take the service type of provider, a factory and service are just simplified versions of this provider. So then why to use this provider instead of factory and service? So the advantage of using provider is this type of service can be configured before injecting that service into our controller. So we can configure this service at runtime. So we can say that before injecting to our controller, we can configure this service. So now we will see how can we configure this service. So let's take a simple functionality of adding a function which sets the version for this books. So this function is nothing but a simple functionality which has a flag. If that flag is true, the version number for the books are set. If the flag is false, these books doesn't have any version number. So now we want to configure our service in such a way that we can set this version number before injecting our service into the controller. And so these type of service can be configured by using a function called config. So we can write a config function which takes a function as argument. This function has the arguments of our provider service. So we can configure a provider service with our service name, which is followed with a provider. Now this object can call any functionality of this object. This object can call all the functionalities which are defined on this object. So now let's call our function of set version. So now we are setting the version to 2. So now when we run our application, we can see that these version number are set to our books. So what our Angular is doing is, before calling this service, it is calling the function of our this set version. This function is called from a config function. So we can consider this object is nothing but our function object, our this entire service function object. That's why book service provider object can access this, it can access this function. So if we set it to false, so now we don't see any version number. So we can say that our provider service can be configured before injecting into our controller. So that is the advantage of using provider service. So now the same configurations cannot be done using factory or this service. So we can only configure a service type of provider. And now in our last session we had already seen the difference between factory and service. So factory is nothing but a simplified version of provider which calls the factory function. So whenever we write a factory, it will call this factory function, and whatever the return object is there, that is exposed to our controller. Whereas if we write the service, so it will call the service constructor, means it will create the object of our service function. So whatever functionality is defined on this object, whatever functionality we have defined on this object is exposed to our controller. And we had already seen that value is a simplified version of our factory. So we can go with value when our factory doesn't need any external services. So if you want to expose only some values to the controller without the use of some external services that to be injected in the factory, then instead of factory we can go with a value. So if we carefully observe our provider service, this service has a function which has a function of $get, and whatever this $get function returns is exposed to our controller. So now let's consider what happens. What if my service needs some external service? So let's say our provider needs $HTTP to fetch the data from the backend. So now where to inject our $HTTP? So now let's inject our $HTTP. Let's inject our $HTTP here, and let's check what happens. So now when we run our application, we can see there is an error. So our services instance, we can say this object as a service instance. In the same way, we can also say this book service is the object of service instance. So this service instance object can only be injected in $get. So these external, so if our service wants any external services, that can be injected in only $get. That can only be injected in the $get function. So now this application runs without any error. In this function, in this function, we can inject service provider object. In this function, we can inject service provider object. So now if we run our application, we can see that there is no errors. So this function is used to inject providers. This function is to inject. This function is used to inject services. So now we haven't discussed yet about constant. So what is the use of constant? So constants look somewhat similar to our value. So let's create a constant service. Let's call this as some app constants. And here I am providing an object of some much. So now use of this constant function is, we can say that this constant function can be injected. This constant function can be injected. We can inject this constant function anywhere. Anywhere in the sense, this constant function can be injected in the controller. This constant function can be injected in different services. This constant function, this constant service can be injected in our $get, and this constant service can also be injected in our provider function. That's why we call this as a service which can be injected anywhere. So we can inject our constant service anywhere. So we can inject our constant service in $get, and also we can inject our constant service in a provider function, whereas we cannot inject any other service in our provider function. So we had seen in our last example, when we had injected just $HTTP in our provider function, our application has thrown errors. So now we are injecting our constant service in a provider function. So now we can see that there is no errors. So then what's the use of this constant? So the main use of constant service is to inject in a provider function. So it can be injected in a provider function. So now let's make this application little dynamic. So instead of hard coding the version, we will get the version from our constant service. So now if we run our application, so we can see that okay. So here we had set the version as false. So let's set this version as true. So now we can see that this version number we are getting from our constant service. So let's change this version number. So now we can see that this version number has been changed. So we are getting this version number from our constant service, which is injected in our provider function. So on a high level, we can say that constant constant service can be injected anywhere in the sense it can inject in a controller. We can inject our constant service in a factory, in a service, or in a dollar get function of our provider, and also we can inject in our provider function. And the use of our provider is we can configure our provider. We can configure our provider service before injecting it into our controller. And technically factory and service both are same, but the way we represent the functionality is different. So in factory we will expose the functionality with the return object, but in the service we will expose our functionality through the constructor of our service function, whereas value is a simplified version of our factory. So all these four type of services are same in the sense, even if we make a service with a value, it will in turn call a factory, and factory will in turn call provider. So we can say that these are nothing but a simplified versions of this. So we will go with a provider whenever we want to configure our service before injecting into our controller, and we will go with a constant if we want to inject some service, if we want to inject some service in our provider function. So this is about different types of services in our AngularJS. Hope you like this video. Thank you.